Ever get that sneaky feeling, like your brain's pulling a fast one on you, showing you what it wants to see, not reality?
Oh, absolutely. It happens to all of us.
Get this, it's not just you. It's called cognitive biases, these mental shortcuts our brains take. And really, once you get them, it's like leveling your decision making. Ready to deep dive into how our minds play tricks on us.
I'm in. These biases, they're everywhere once you start to see them. Affects everyone, even, the people who think they're the most objective.
Right. Like our brains, they're wired for efficiency, not always being right. It's like taking a shortcut.
Oh.
But sometimes that shortcut dumps you right in a ditch,
Exactly. Imagine if we actually stopped to process every bit of information coming at us, we'd be totally overwhelmed.
No kidding.
The text we both looked at, it mentions how overthinking itself can feed these biases. Ugh, overthinking. Don't get me started. I overthink what cereal to buy. Okay, so shortcuts gone wrong. What's like a bias example we're all prone to?
Confirmation bias is a big one. It's that thing where our brain just loves to find information that backs up what we already believe.
Yeah.
Even if we're wrong.
Oh, so like if you're convinced your favorite band is amazing, even their bad albums, you're finding ways to justify it.
Exactly. The text even mentioned this study published in Nursing Research about how, that whole full moon makes people act wild idea.
Oh, yeah. Blame it on the full moon.
Total myth.
Yeah.
But people believe it because they're looking for confirmation. They see someone acting up and bam, full moon must be true.
Wow. So even professionals like the researchers in that study, they got to watch out for this bias, huh?
Yeah.
It shows how sneaky it is. We remember things that support our existing beliefs and kind of forget the stuff that doesn't.
Okay, makes sense, but still a little unsettling. So how do we fight that?
Well, just knowing about it is huge. Like when you find yourself grabbing onto info that supports what you want to be true, hit pause. Are you really looking at all sides?
Yeah, easy to get stuck in our little echo chambers these days.
For sure. Which leads us to another sneaky one, anchoring bias. This is all about first impressions.
Anchoring. Intriguing. Go on.
So think of it like this. You see a really expensive item, right? Now everything else seems cheap compared to that first price.
Oh, like I'm way more likely to overpay if that first number I saw was ridiculous, sets the bar high.
That first piece of info, that price, it's the anchor. The source mentioned salary negotiations. Whether it's you naming a number first or them, that sets the tone for the whole discussion.
So that starting point, whatever it is, it's like our brain judges everything else against that, distorting our view.
Right. Prices, opinions, you name it. Being aware of anchoring bias is key. Recognize that initial piece of information, it might be throwing you off.
This is already blowing my mind. So much to think about when it comes to how our brains work. Okay, so we've got confirmation bias, anchoring bias. But I'm guessing there are way more of these mental gymnastics our brains are doing without us realizing it, right?
Oh, we've just scratched the surface. There are so many fascinating ways our minds try to simplify the world around us. But like we've been saying, that simplification, it often comes with a cost.
And that's why we're here, to uncover those hidden costs and learn how to outsmart our own brains.
It's like our brains are full of these pre-programmed shortcuts, right? But we're not always conscious of how they're working.
So there are upsides and downsides to these biases, kind of a double-edged sword situation.
Exactly. Think about it. For our ancient ancestors, these biases were essential for survival.
Okay, I can see where you're going with this.
Yeah.
Our caveman brains needed those shortcuts to avoid danger, right? Like if you see something moving in the shadows, better to assume it's a saber-toothed tiger and run like crazy instead of stopping to investigate if it's just the wind.
You got it. Back then, a little bit of bias could literally save your life. But fast forward to today, those same shortcuts can lead us to make decisions that aren't always in our best interest. Like, we might misjudge a situation because our brain is relying on outdated instincts.
So it's not that our brains are trying to sabotage us. It's more like they're working with outdated software.
Precisely. Our brains are still wired for a world that doesn't quite exist anymore.
Which is why it's so important to be aware of these biases. So we're not just reacting instinctively all the time, but actually making conscious choices.
Absolutely. Awareness is key. Once we understand how these biases work, we can start to recognize when they're influencing our decisions and take steps to counteract them.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So what's the next bias on our list? What other mental quirks do we need to be on the lookout for?
This next one is a real crowd pleaser, the bandwagon effect. We humans are social creatures. We crave belonging, being part of the group, and this bias plays right into that.
Oh yeah, the bandwagon effect. I know this one all too well. It's that feeling of, like, you hear a song for the first time and you're not sure about it, but then it's everywhere, everyone's listening to it, and suddenly you find yourself singing along.
Exactly. It's like our brains tell us, hey, if everyone else is doing it, it must be the right thing to do.
Right. There's comfort in numbers,
Right.
safety in going with the flow.
Exactly. The text made a great point about this, linking it back to our ancestors. Back then, going against the tribe could have meant being ostracized, which could be a death sentence. But in today's world, blindly following the crowd can lead us down some pretty questionable paths.
So just because something's popular doesn't mean it's right, or even that it makes sense.
Precisely. Sometimes the crowd is wrong. We have to be willing to think for ourselves, even if it means going against the grain.
Love that. So how do we avoid getting swept up in the excitement of the bandwagon parade? How do we stay grounded and make sure we're not just following the crowd blindly?
Cultivate that critical thinking. Question everything. Just because a lot of people believe something doesn't automatically make it true. Do your own research, consider different perspectives, and don't be afraid to be the lone voice of dissent if you genuinely believe something different.
Question everything. I'm going to write that on a Post-it note. Okay, so we've talked about the dangers of confirmation bias, anchoring bias, and hopping on the bandwagon. What other hidden thought traps do we need to watch out for?
This next one might hit a little too close to home for some of us. It's the ostrich effect.
The ostrich effect. You mean like burying your head in the sand and pretending there's no problem?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I've done that once or twice, or maybe a little more than that. Tell me more.
We all have. It's that tendency to avoid information, especially if it's negative or unpleasant. Like if we just ignore it, maybe it'll go away.
Like that pile of laundry that magically disappears if you just close your bedroom door and pretend it's not there. Spoiler alert, it never actually disappears.
Exactly. But the problem is, ignoring our problems usually just makes them worse in the long run. The text highlighted this study about how people manage their finances. Those who avoided looking at their bank statements, they actually ended up with more debt than those who, even though they might have had some anxiety, faced their financial situation head on.
It's like that saying, sunlight is the best disinfectant. Sometimes you've just got to air it out and face reality. But that's easier said than done, right? Our brains are wired to protect us from unpleasant feelings.
It's true. But remember, those feelings are temporary. But the consequences of avoidance, those can last a lot longer.
So how do we coax our inner ostrich out of the sand? What are some practical tips for facing those uncomfortable truths?
Baby steps. Start by acknowledging that there's a problem, even if you don't feel ready to tackle it head on. Break down big, overwhelming problems into smaller, more manageable steps. And don't be afraid to ask for help. Sometimes just talking to someone about what you're going through can make a world of difference.
All great advice. Okay, so we've covered some major ground here. Confirmation bias, anchoring bias, the bandwagon effect, and the ostrich effect. And I have a feeling we're not done yet. There's still so much to uncover when it comes to these cognitive biases.
Oh, there's so much more. But the good news is, the more we understand about these biases, the better equipped we are to outsmart them.
So we've talked about all these ways our brains try to simplify things, those shortcuts that aren't always so accurate. But this next bias, it's almost like our brains have superpowers.
Right. This one's straight out of a comic book, The Placebo Effect, where just believing something will work can actually make it work.
Yeah. Like those studies with sugar pills tell someone it's a painkiller, and some people, their pain actually goes down. It's wild.
The mind-body connection is powerful, and it gets even weirder. The text also mentioned the opposite, the nocebo effect.
Chamakali.
Nocebo. Basically, it's the placebo's evil twin. You believe something will harm you, and bam, you might actually experience negative effects even if there's no real danger.
Wait, seriously. So our expectations, they can impact us both ways, positive and negative. That's kind of freaky.
Totally. The text mentioned this study from Italy. Researchers took people who were lactose intolerant, told them they were getting lactose, but it was a placebo.
So they tricked them into thinking, here comes the stomachache.
Yep. And guess what? A bunch of them, they got the symptoms even though there was no actual lactose.
That's nuts. It's like our minds are so powerful they can create real physical reactions. This is blowing my mind here. Okay, so much to unpack with just that.
Yeah.
But there was one more bias the text mentioned. Something about survivors, right?
Yes. Survivorship bias. It's our tendency to only see the success stories, the survivors, and completely miss all the failures along the way.
Oh, right. Like seeing those lottery winners and thinking, I could be next. But forgetting about the millions who didn't win a dime.
Exactly. The text used entrepreneurs as an example. We see successful businesses and think, easy, I can do that. But we don't see all the businesses that crashed and burned, the ones that never became those inspiring stories.
So we're getting a very skewed view of reality. It's like those Instagram feeds, all sunshine and rainbows, but no one's posting their struggles.
Right. And this bias, it pops up everywhere. Think about music. We see the bands selling out stadiums, but for every one of those, there are thousands of talented musicians who never got that lucky break.
It's like we're comparing our behind the scenes to everyone else's highlight reel. Not exactly a fair comparison, is it? So how do we avoid falling for this survivorship trap? How do we stay grounded and see the full picture?
It's about remembering that success is rarely a straight line. There are bumps, setbacks, failures. It's all part of the process. Instead of just focusing on the outcome, look at the whole story. You'll get a much more realistic perspective.
That's such a great point. We've covered so much ground in this deep dive: confirmation bias, anchoring bias, the bandwagon effect, the ostrich effect, placebo, nocebo, survivorship bias. Our brains are like mental obstacle courses. So as we wrap things up, what's the main takeaway for our listeners? How can understanding these biases actually help them in their lives?
Honestly, the biggest win is just knowing these biases exist. Once you see them, you can't unsee them. Start paying attention to your own thought patterns. Question your assumptions, get different perspectives, and remember, your brain loves a good shortcut. Sometimes you got to slow down, think it through, take the scenic route to avoid those mental potholes.
Love that, take the scenic route. And for our listeners, here's a challenge. Think of something you believe strongly, anything. Now go try to find evidence that might disprove it. Consider it a workout for your brain. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the fascinating and sometimes frustrating world of cognitive biases. We'll catch you next